I used to be really into street racing and often participated in the local scene. On the weekends, we'd meet up in the parking lot of an abandoned or closed store, then around 10 or 11, all drive out to a secret location to race. Sometimes we would go to a nice straight piece of highway or an old deserted airport in the country. We would usually not know our final destination for the night until we were all on the highway out of town. Generally, we would get our instructions over the portable radios that we all kept in our cars. There were a few of the older guys that had become the de facto leaders of our group, and they were the ones that got together to decide where we'd race that night. The plan was to not gather in the same place too often. We hoped this would keep the police on their toes and out of our hair. If I remember right, this happened on a Saturday night sometime during summer vacation. It was a hopping night, and everyone was enjoying the break from school. A friend of mine had just done some major mods to his S4 and was stoked to put it to the test. We'd chosen to race on a quiet piece of highway at the edge of the county line. When my friend's turn came up, he was running against one of the older dude's Civics that was known to be one of the fastest cars in our part of the state. They were racing for a couple of $100. I'm not sure of the exact amount, but it was mainly for bragging rights, and my friend thought his chances were good. They'd lined up a quarter-mile away from the bridge that crossed over the highway that we all watched from. Off the line, the older dude's Civic was faster and had a good 2-car length lead, but slowly, my friend's Audi started catching up and soon they were side by side on the road, staring each other down. At that point, we're not sure what happened, but my friend's Audi seemed to have swerved toward the Civic once, but he was able to regain control. Unfortunately, he must have lost control again, but he was unable to pull out of it and slammed into the side of the Civic. The Civic was then slammed into the left-hand side concrete wall, but to our surprise, my friend's Audi swerved back all the way across both lanes and slammed into the right-hand wall. Both cars slowly rolled to a stop, and everything fell silent. It seemed like an eternity before somebody got the courage to run down to the cars and check on the drivers. At the speed they had to have been going, which was surely well over 100 miles, no one had much hope for their survival. I knew if I didn't go check on my friend, everybody would give me a hard time, so I took a big breath and let it out, and headed for his car. The walk to the car has to be the longest I've ever taken. In the distance, to my amazement, the dude in the Civic was moving and yelling something. I could see before I even made it to my friend's car that he wasn't moving. The front of it was crushed all the way to the driver's compartment and beyond. Upon approach, I couldn't even see his body at all, but once I got within a foot of the car, the true horror of the situation hit me like a sledgehammer. His body was slumped over sideways in the seat with the seatbelt holding it in a somewhat upright position. The really awful part was that his head was gone. At first, I thought it was being blocked by his body, but sadly, I was wrong. When I was at touching distance from him, I could see that it had been completely severed. How, I'm still not sure, but after a more intense search, the paramedics discovered it wedged in the passenger side floorboard. As soon as the reality of the horrid sight really hit me, I found myself overwhelmed. Lightheadedness came over me, and I had to sit down on the cement wall to regain my composure. As I sat there, I watched as the driver of the Civic continued to yell about what I finally could tell was the pain in his leg. The crash had apparently caused the car to pin his leg between the dash and the floorboard. Some of the others on the bridge continued to call me and ask about my friend, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. They'd find out on their own eventually. The ambulances and police showed up soon after I sat down and began working on getting the guy in the Civic out. The second they all saw my friend's condition, they moved on to the Civic. At first, everybody tried to lie to the cops about what had happened, but I saw no point. So, when they spoke to me, I told them exactly what I saw. The firemen did manage to get the guy in the Civic out, but he ended up losing his leg anyway. I couldn't bear to look when they removed my friend from the car. Thankfully, most of the other racers were already gone when this happened. The cops released me soon after, and when I got home, I told my parents about what had happened. They'd been worried about my participation in the scene for quite a while, and they were very relieved to hear when I told them I was never going to race again. Seeing my friend die in such a horrible way made it all look so silly. I couldn't see the point of spending so much money on something so dangerous. Soon after, I sold my Supra to another guy I knew and put the money in my college fund. From time to time, I see a friend from the old days, and they tell me about the death of another racer. Meanwhile, I'll be graduating this fall with a degree. Most of those dudes haven't even gone to college and probably never will. I'm not saying I'm better because I have, but I certainly feel safer with the choice I've made. I'm Mike, and I'm here to share a story involving a very dangerous and scary situation I went through just the other night on my way to my girlfriend's house. Most of the area I had to drive through is heavily developed. However, there's a stretch of roughly 5 miles that is probably just as rough as it was when my ancestors settled in the area just after the Civil War. It doesn't really matter how long it's been this way. I'm only trying to convey the idea that it's completely undeveloped to you. I sometimes get too wrapped up in the history of the area and ramble on about it. I apologize for that, and I promise I'll do my best to be as brief as possible when giving you the facts of what led up to the occurrence. Regardless of the history of that part of the road, there are no businesses or houses along that stretch, mainly just open fields and woods. Not to mention, at the time of night when I'm usually going back and forth on the highway, there are few, if any, cars on that particular stretch. It's usually a quiet and enjoyable part to drive on, and the entire time I've traveled on it, which must have been hundreds, I never imagined that anything scary or violent could happen to me. Man, was I wrong. That night, I clocked out just after midnight and sent my girl a quick text to let her know I was on my way. The plan was to spend the night at her place, so after a stop to get gas, I hit the road. That late in the evening, I didn't see many cars going my direction, so I floored it in hopes of getting to her house fast. However, in just a matter of minutes, I came up behind 2 cars driving next to each other at a slow speed. I'm not sure what they were doing, and I didn't care. I just wanted one of them to get out of my way so I could continue on my journey. In my haste, I honked at the car ahead of me in the passing lane. I'm not a jerk, I didn't lay on it. I just gave them a short beep to announce my presence. To my relief, the car sped up and moved over in front of the other car to allow me to pass. I was thankful to them for doing this, so I gave them a kind little wave. You know, the kind you give to a passing neighbor. Eager to get to my destination, I floored the gas again, but before I could even get 20 feet down the road, the car behind me turned on its brights and blinded me. This ticked me off, but I flipped up my rearview mirror and tried to ignore it. If being blinded wasn't bad enough, the driver crossed the line to dangerous. Out of nowhere, I was rammed in the rear and almost lost control of my car. I realized then that I was in big trouble. There didn't seem to be any way to get out of this other than to outrun them, so I put the pedal all the way to the floor and prayed I could get away. Before I could gain enough speed, I was rammed again, this time much harder. My head was thrust forward and back by the collision. The pain came on almost immediately. Thankfully, I was able to pull away and leave the other car behind, but I could still see them about 60 yards in the distance trying to catch me. This was the moment I was saved. Most people wouldn't look forward to being caught speeding, but in the circumstances, I was relieved. I'd just lost sight of the car in my mirror when everything was lit up with blue and red colors. Overjoyed, I quickly pulled my car over and got out to greet the cop. He was a little nervous when I jumped out of the car, but soon enough, I was able to get him to understand what I was doing. When he shined his flashlight on the back of my car, we could see the damage, and it was bad. Of course, both of my taillights were busted, and the rear clip was crumpled up like an accordion. I told him what had just happened, and he had me follow him up the road to file a more in-depth report. He told me he'd do his best, but the odds they'd find the driver were low, and that's what I'd figured when I made the report. I was just relieved to be alive and out of danger. My neck was still hurting, so my next stop was the emergency room. I called my girl from the waiting room, and she almost had a heart attack when I told her what had happened. She soon met me there, and she made me let her follow me on the drive to her house. Like I expected, I had whiplash. All they could do was give me some prescriptions and tell me to come back if the pain got worse. Despite the sore neck, by the time I finally made it back to her house, I fell asleep instantly. Since then, I've had my girlfriend stay over at my place, and as far as I know, the cops haven't caught the driver. Like I said, I'm not telling you guys this story to scare you. I'm sharing it to remind you to be careful on the road at night and always be mindful of the way you treat other drivers. Just because you don't intend to make them angry doesn't mean that they won't get mad. My trucking route takes me from here in Connecticut all the way down to Kentucky and Tennessee. It's a pretty good run. I get to see pretty much all the sights the East Coast has to offer. But there's one area of the country that gets pretty wild, and that's the region around the Appalachian Mountains. You guys probably know that it's one of the poorest areas of the country, one that got hit hard as coal mining jobs started to decline and the local economy suffered. I really feel for those people down there. Seeing how deeply entrenched in poverty some of the families are is just heartbreaking. So, I was driving through an unfamiliar area of the state due to my usual highway being blocked off by a huge traffic accident that unfortunately resulted in a few fatalities. My phone ran out of battery, and to make matters worse, the charger decided to quit as well. Talk about terrible timing. However, I'm an experienced truck driver, and I wasn't driving an 18-wheeler on that particular run, so I could take some smaller roads to find my way around. But despite my confidence on the roads, there was a point where I found myself completely lost, and I started to worry about missing my shipping delivery deadline. That would lead to disciplinary proceedings and all sorts of trouble that I just couldn't afford. Anyway, I spotted a guy walking along the side of the road, so I slowed down, rolled down the window, and asked him for directions. He seemed friendly enough and was willing to take a few minutes to give me all the information I needed to find my way back to the main highways heading south. Then I asked him if there was anywhere nearby to grab some lunch, as it was nearing 1 in the afternoon and I'd only managed a meager breakfast. The guy took a moment to think, scratching his head, taking unusually long to answer a question that typically takes seconds. It's unusual to be in West Virginia without a Cracker Barrel nearby, so I couldn't understand why he didn't point me to one of those. When I pressed him, he told me about an old family-run place that supposedly had the best chicken fried steak in the entire county, maybe even the state. Suddenly, all was forgiven. Despite being from the north, I couldn't pass up a good chicken fried steak. The delay in his response was because he was trying to remember a route that wouldn't lead me down a rundown dirt road that could get my truck stuck, which would have been a disaster. After a minute, he gave me detailed directions to an old strip mall. He mentioned it was mostly abandoned, but assured me the restaurant was still open along with a few other smaller businesses. He advised not to worry if it seemed quiet during lunchtime, as they did most of their business in the early to late evening. I was content, thanked the guy, and followed the directions he'd given. It took a bit of time to locate the old strip mall he had mentioned. It was frustrating to drive past a couple of chain restaurants when I was so hungry. But I was craving that country-style chicken fried steak, and if it was a family-run place, that was even better. Chain restaurant food just can't compare to genuine, home-style cooking. Eventually, I found the rundown strip mall he had referred to. It wasn't surprising that the place was in such disrepair. It was far from any highway, with absolutely no signage to indicate its presence. Worse yet, there was no sign that any restaurant was open in any of the units. But I wasn't going to give up easily. I saw one place with a sign that read something like Mama J's Country Kitchen or something similar. My hopes were renewed. As I approached, I saw a man stepping out of the place, looking over at my truck. I waved to him from the driver's side, excited to finally get some decent food after the long, lonely drive from Connecticut. I assumed he hadn't noticed my wave due to the sun blocking his vision or something, because he continued to stare without acknowledgement. I parked my truck, locked the doors, and began walking towards the restaurant. I called out to the man when I was about halfway across the parking lot, asking if they were open for business. Once again, the guy didn't react. He continued to stare in a way that I now realized was distinctly unwelcoming. A gut feeling told me to halt my steps. A creeping sensation all over my body signaled that something was terribly wrong with this situation. Just as I began feeling vulnerable, the man reached behind his back, pulled something out of his pocket, and put it on his head. At first, I thought it was a woolly hat, but he pulled it down, revealing a balaclava. I noticed something else in his hand, a small revolver. I turned and sprinted back to my truck. As I did, I saw a few other men emerging from the derelict units, running toward my truck to cut me off. Each of them held a weapon, be it a knife or an iron bar. The sight of this propelled me to run even faster. Thank goodness my gut feeling kicked in when it did, otherwise, they would have reached my truck before I did. I flung open the door, jumped inside, and locked the cab behind me. I trembled as I fumbled in my pocket for the keys. The bandits encircled my truck's cab, striking the chassis with their weapons and demanding that I exit. Then the man with the gun aimed it at my face through the windshield, screaming at me to get out of the truck. I had no choice but to take action. I revved the engine, plowed into the group of them, knocking down those who didn't manage to move out of the way in time. I hunkered down in my seat, gripping the wheel out of pure instinct, and once again, I was grateful for that impulse. When I hit the man with the gun, he fired a shot that shattered the windshield and hit the seat just above my head. I circled the parking lot, expecting another shot at any moment. Only the bandits who had evaded my initial charge were pursuing me. 2 or 3 were sprawled on the concrete, writhing in pain while clutching their limbs. I believe that's what saved me, the decision to ram them rather than trying to reverse out of there. If I'd chosen the latter, I might not be here to recount all of this. I fled that parking lot, speeding off blindly in the first direction I could until I found a safe place to pull over and call the cops. The sheriff's deputy I spoke to advised me to swing by the department when I could so I could provide a statement, which I did. However, not before I managed to finally get lunch. Not even the terror of nearly being hijacked could suppress my appetite. I guess that might make me sound pretty darn hungry or whatever, but you need to understand just how famished I was. At the department, I learned that I wasn't the first truck driver to encounter these bandits. Somehow, I had the misfortune of asking directions from one of their accomplices who directed me to the rundown strip mall before alerting his associates. At least, that's the only conclusion we reached once I described the guy who gave me directions. The deputy seemed to nod knowingly when I detailed his physical appearance. I suppose I'm just cautioning you all to be extremely careful on the roads. And while it might sound like a cliched cautionary tale from your aunt's Facebook posts, it's wise to be cautious when interacting with strangers. You never truly know who they might be.